Hello, and welcome back to our study of James. We do this every Monday, Wednesday, Friday here on the Digital Bible Study, and we are dealing with the New Testament book of James. We're into our I think today's our third class, and so I see folks jumping back into the chat room, so welcome back to those of you that I recognize from before, and if you haven't joined us before, I hope you find the study of James profitable. We're in James chapter 1, and we've looked at the introduction of the book, the idea that James is writing to a very Jewish audience, Jewish Christians who have converted. They've been scattered because of the persecution that broke out in Acts chapter 8, and they've been scattered from their homeland, and so the first 12 verses of the letter deals with the difficulties with trials, and certainly to a group of people that have been scattered because of their faith, they're experiencing trials, real tangible difficulties in life. And James has helped them, and by implication us, learn how to deal with those difficulties of life and deal with those struggles of trial. And I want to just recap that in verse 12, he said, "Blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, for once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him." We talked about the fact that that kind of closes the topic of trials. There's actually three words in verse 12 that connect us back to chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. But he now moves on to what in the original language is the same word, but it's going to be translated tempted. And at the end of class, we talked about this, but I want to reiterate it because I think it's very important. We have the same word here that is translated trial in chapter 1, verse 2, and in verse 12 is the same word that we're going to see here for tempted. So why did the translators not translate it trial? Why the change in topic? Well, if you remember in chapter 1, verse 2, James is talking about these things that fall upon us. He said, "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials," or when you fall upon various trials. That suggests these things that come at us from the outside, things that just happen as part of our walk in this world, as part of our life in a fallen world. Things happen to us from the outside. And the translators chose the word trial to represent that. The shift is actually going to be now, James is going to talk about things that come at us from the inside, not just those external trials that we fall upon. You remember that was the same idea as the man who went from Jerusalem to Jericho to Jerusalem. The story of the Good Samaritan, the man fell among robbers. Same idea in chapter 1, verse 2. But now notice he's going to say in verse 13, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone." But notice verse 14. "But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust." So James is going to talk about these temptations that come up from within inside us. They come from our own desires. They come from our own lusts. But let's start it with his argument in verse 13. And it seems that at least some are suggesting that if they're being tempted by God. Where does this come from? Well, there's a Jewish concept that's called the Yetzer Hara. It's the evil inclination. It has a number of facets to it, but the idea basically is this. If I'm tempted by something, then it's really God's fault because God made me. And so if God made me and I'm tempted by something, then God made me to be tempted by something. And so if I fall to that temptation, it's really God's fault, not my fault. It's just the way I was made. As a matter of fact, some took it so far as to suggest that if we don't succumb to the temptation, then we're not fulfilling the way God made us. The logic is certainly, if God made me to be tempted, then he wanted me to have this thing. And so if I then have it, if he then wants to punish me for that, he can't, because it's really his fault, not mine. You get the idea. Well, where does this come from? I mean, where do they get this idea from? And the interesting thing is that we can see it all the way back in the beginning. If you flip in your Bible with me for just a second and go all the way back to the garden, we're going to see something interesting in the garden. You remember the story. Adam and Eve are placed in the garden. God tells them not to eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In chapter 2, verse 17, the serpent comes to the woman and tempts her. I will remind you that the man, Adam, is right there with her. She's not off by herself. When you look at that context, Adam is right there with her. So, but I want you to notice in verse 11 and 12. Notice starting in Genesis chapter 3, verse 11, and he said, God said, who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree which I commanded you not to eat? And the man said, the woman that you gave to be with me, she gave me from the tree and I ate. So who is Adam really blaming? Well, at first gloss, we would say he's blaming the woman, but he's really not. He's partially blaming the woman, but notice the verse very carefully. The woman that you gave me. You see, God, if you hadn't given me this woman, I wouldn't have eaten. Well, we know that's not true. God gave Adam the commandment, told him not to eat from the tree, and ultimately he ate of his own choice. The woman didn't pin him to the ground. Eve didn't pin him to the ground and force the food into his mouth. He chose to eat. But notice that argument, that woman that you gave me, God, she's the one that's, the problem. You gave me this temptation, and so really it's your fault. And so some have taken that concept all the way back from Genesis and bring it forward into a modern context and develop this concept of the evil inclination, the Yetzer Hara. We're made this way. It's not our fault. And James says, let no one say when he's tempted, he's being tempted by God. Now, I want you to notice something real quick here, that there is this argument. James is saying, let no one say. It does appear that some are saying this, and James is aware of it. We're going to see a couple of times in James where he presents these arguments or excuses that may be being made by these early Christians for their bad behavior. Certainly we do the same thing, don't we? There are times when we try to justify our behavior by making weak excuses, and that's happening here. And James is going to deal with their excuse, right? They can't say that God is the source of their temptation. And so why? What is the answer that James gives to this? There's really two. I mean, you could really break it down into three, but there's really two main arguments that James is going to make. The first is right here in verse 13. For God cannot be tempted by evil. When we understand the purity of God, when we understand who God is, the creator and owner of the entire universe, what is there within the universe that could tempt him? He has everything he could ever want. He has everything he needs. He created it all. It all belongs to him. And so he's not driven by temptations like man is. He doesn't have the same nature that we have. And so certainly that's one aspect of this idea that God cannot be tempted by evil. But notice also, if we look at passages like 1 John chapter 1, verse 5, John reminds us that God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. I mean, God is light, and there's no part of him that's not light. And so he's not tempted by evil because there is no evil in him. There is only good in God. He is good personified, deified, if you will. And so for God cannot be tempted by evil. Notice he goes on to say, and he does not tempt anyone. Now, you might break those into two different arguments, and I wouldn't completely disagree. I really think it's argument 1A and 1B. I think they are associated with each other. God can't be tempted by evil, and he doesn't tempt anyone. Well, why doesn't he tempt anyone? Because he can't be tempted by evil. And if he tempted us, that would be evil, wouldn't it? I mean, if God promises to provide us with a mechanism to spend eternity in heaven with him, if he promises us a means of salvation, and then he spends his time working to tempt us to fall from that reward, well, that would be evil, wouldn't it? I mean, he's saying he wants one thing, but then he's constantly working to try to get us to lose that salvation. See, that would be evil. That would be the epitome of evil. And so the two arguments really go hand in hand. God's not tempted by evil, and as a result, he doesn't tempt anyone to fall. As a matter of fact, not only does God not cause the temptation, but God, we find in Scripture, is working within the temptations that we face to provide a way of escape. If you notice 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, Paul, writing to the Corinthian church, is going to say, no temptation is overtaking you, but such as is common to man. Right? I mean, everybody is tempted. Earthly men are tempted. We just feel that desire. He's going to tell us in a minute where that comes from. It comes from our own lust, but no temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man. And God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able. Have you ever thought about that? That God is actually working to limit the temptations in our life so that we won't fall to them. You know, how often do we blame God even when we do fall, or we blame ourselves and we say, I just wasn't strong enough to resist that temptation? Well, we need to be careful there. We are strong enough. We just choose not to be strong enough. But God is actually working to limit the power of those temptations so that we won't be overcome by them. That he is actively, through his providence, through his working in the world, he's actually limiting the temptations in our life so that we can have the strength to overcome them. I'm really hopeful, and I don't have a scripture that would tell us that other than 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. But I'm hopeful that at some point during the judgment, God is going to show us all the times in our life where he stepped in and said, no, I'm not going to allow that temptation in that individual's life because they won't be strong enough to endure it. And that would cause them to stumble. And so I'm going to limit that temptation for them. I'm going to help them in this particular situation. So what does that tell us? It tells us that every temptation that we have to sin can be overcome. Doesn't matter how difficult it is. And I know there's times when the pull of those temptations seems so strong that we just can't resist. But the reality is we can. God is working to limit the force of those temptations. And notice Paul goes on in 1 Corinthians 10:13 to say that God will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide a way of escape also so that you will be able to endure it. God isn't the source of the temptation. God is the source of the solution, which I find fascinating. That means that God has built into every temptation a way out. I always think back to Joseph and Potiphar's wife. If you remember the Old Testament story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife, this woman is after Joseph physically. She finally corners him and he escapes, leaving his coat behind. He hits the door, right? He just has to get out of there. Sometimes the way of escape God has provided is simply a doorway, isn't it? I mean, that we just need to leave the environment that is causing the temptation. Maybe some of us are tempted by some of the things we see on our computer screens. You know what? God made a power button on the computer. He made an off switch to the internet. He's, and I'm joking, obviously, but you get my point. There is a way of escape, isn't there? There are mechanisms, but we have to be aware to look for them. We have to, rather than blame God for our temptation, we need to see how God is limiting that temptation, the strength that he's giving us. And if you remember, the testing of our faith produces endurance. That strength allows us to deal with trials. With that same strength can allow us to deal with temptations. We build endurance in those temptations, don't we? And God helps us through those temptations. He provides a way of escape. He works to limit the temptations in our life so that we will not be overcome from them. It's a powerful testimony to God's love for us in that he does not cause the temptations. Why? Because he is light. In him, there is no darkness at all. God isn't tempted by evil, and he does not tempt anyone. As a matter of fact, the exact opposite is the case. But notice where the problem really is. Verse 14, but each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lusts. Notice the wording of verse 14 very carefully. Notice, but each one is tempted. That would indicate that we all have our temptations, don't we? And I would suggest that we all have temptations that are unique to ourselves. That doesn't mean that others aren't tempted by the same thing that we're tempted. But while temptation is universal in scope, it is unique in design. It's custom made for each individual. Why is that? Because we make it. We're the ones that decide what we lust and desire after. We are the ones that look at the world through our lens, sometimes our lack of wisdom. And if you remember, we talked about that theme of wisdom throughout the book of James, the ability to see earthly things the way God would see them and act accordingly. Sometimes we lack the wisdom to see a situation the way God sees it, and we succumb to that temptation. But that temptation is out of our own desires and lusts, not something that God gave us. And so notice he says, but each one is tempted. He's contrasting the previous verse, talking about how each one of us is going to have to deal with this struggle at some point in our life. We all have them. We all have to learn to deal with them. But he says when he's carried away and enticed by his own lust. You know, when you look at temptation and you look at this idea of the source of temptation, where do they come from? What is it all about? It comes from us. Now, I'm old enough to remember an old television show, and it was when I was a teenager. So if you're much younger than I am, you probably don't remember this. But I know that some of you are my age. There used to be a comedian on television whose name was Flip Wilson. And Flip Wilson, he was this short, stocky man. But one of the things that he used to do is he used to dress up as a woman named Geraldine. And Geraldine's favorite saying was, the devil made me do it. Whenever something went wrong, it was always, the devil made me do it. It was hysterical. Well, notice that James says it's not God that's the source of the temptation, but it's not Satan either. Now, Satan provides temptations in the world, but notice James doesn't throw Satan under the bus here. He doesn't say it's not God, it's the evil one that is responsible for your temptations. He says you are. Each one is tempted when he's carried away and enticed by his own lusts. So often we're always looking to pin it on somebody else. We're always looking to make an excuse. I don't know how many of you grew up with brothers and sisters in your family. I had an older sister, and whenever we would get in trouble and mom or dad would catch us doing something and say, who did this? We both point at each other and say, they did it, right? Always hoping that someone else would get blamed for something we did. Well, the reality is James strips all that away here and reminds us that we can't point the finger at anyone but ourselves. It's not God's fault. It's not Satan's fault. It's our fault. It's when we allow ourselves to be carried away. Notice these words that he's going to use. The word here for carried away is a unique word. It's only found here in this verse in James, and it means to be taken in tow, to be dragged off. We allow ourselves to be dragged away by our desires and enticed by our lust. The word for enticed here, it means to bait a hook, much like you to be lured, or just like you put bait in the water to catch a fish. Peter is going to use this same word in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 14 to 18, to talk about how false teachers entice unstable souls and how they bait the hook. In essence, we see the shiny thing in the water. And if any of you out there are fishermen or have ever gone fishing before, you know, you put something shiny in the water and what happens? That fish thinks it's something good to eat. They see the shiny and they grab it. They don't notice the hook. Well, isn't that the same with our lusts and our desires? We see the shiny thing. We see the thing that looks attractive, but we don't look for the hook. We don't look for the danger. We just react sometimes out of our own lustful desire, and we grab that shiny thing in the water. Next thing you know, we're being pulled away. We're being taken in tow. You know, I think a great example of this would be David and Bathsheba in the Old Testament. David finds himself on the roof and he's looking out over his kingdom, and across the way he sees a woman bathing on the top of her roof. Has David sinned at that point? It doesn't appear so. He may have been tempted, but if he gets off the roof, if he goes and takes a cold shower, if you forgive me, but if he goes and forgets about Bathsheba and goes about his work and just never thinks about her again, maybe he was tempted, but he hasn't sinned. But what's the problem? The problem is David reacts to that temptation and he calls for her. Maybe his excuse to his men in his court is, I just want to talk to her. But we know that that's not the case, right? He eventually sleeps with her. They have a child together. It manifests itself to the point where he murders her husband on the battlefield, intentionally has him set out so that he'll be killed, all to hide this. And Nathan the prophet comes to David and tells him this story about a little ewe lamb. And David is just mortified that somebody would do that. And Nathan says, you are that man. Do you think at that moment, David recognized that he had been dragged off by his own sin? Do you think David stopped at some point and said, how on earth did I get here? Sometimes that's what sin does to us when we don't stay sharp, when we don't stay on the alert, when we don't stay sober. That's a word that Peter's going to use in his letters to the early church, that being sober-minded, being on the alert for the schemes of the devil, recognizing that he's a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. When we don't remain sharp in our thinking, our desires can drag us off. And the next thing you know, we've committed a sin, and we stop and we ask ourselves, how on earth did I get here? Well, James just told us we allowed ourselves to be carried away. We saw the bait in the water, but we didn't look for the hook. And that's exactly our problem, isn't it? Well, so what are some of these temptations that I would agree that Satan puts out there for us? What are some areas of our life that we need to concern ourselves with? Well, I think there's an interesting passage in Job chapter 1. And if you flip over to Job chapter 1, verses 9 and 10, Satan has a conversation with God that I think really reveals a lot about how Satan tries to set traps for our lusts and our desires. Again, don't get me wrong, and please don't leave this verse thinking Satan is the problem. Satan sets the hook, but we're the one that reacts to the hook in the water, right? We're the one that takes the bait. But how does he do that? And how does he work in the world? Well, there's not a lot of verses that tell us, but Job chapter 1, verse 9 and 10, Satan is talking with God, and then Satan talked to God. Remember, the Lord had said, have you considered my servant Job? And Satan answers and says to God, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge about him and his household and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. What's Satan's argument? Well, you've protected Job, and that's why he stays faithful to you. But did you notice Satan's answer to God when God said, have you considered my servant Job? The answer is absolutely I have. I've looked at Job very carefully, and I've discovered that you've built a hedge around 3 areas of his life, and those are the areas Satan looks at to get to us. Notice the first one. Have you not made a hedge about him, about his character, right? Our individual character starts with us, starts with our heart, starts with the way we think, starts with our worldview, and Satan looks for a way to get to us through our character. Have we revealed some flaw in our character, some pride, some ego, some temptation that we've revealed because we have succumbed ourselves to it? And we've revealed that to Satan, and we've allowed him to identify some weakness in our character that he can then set the bait. You know, when you go fishing, you set the lure for certain kinds of fish. Like out here in Colorado, we do a lot of trout fishing. I know in a lot of other areas of the country, they do a lot of bass fishing. Well, if I try to go bass fishing with bait that's made for trouts, I'm not going to be very successful. And if you are used to bass fishing and you come to Colorado and you use those same lures to try to catch trout, you're probably not going to catch them. You know, Satan customizes the bait based on what he sees in our life, what he has observed us do. And so he looks at our character and tries to customize his temptations for our lusts. That's the first one. The second one is he had already looked at Job's house. What does that mean? He looked at all the people in Job's family that have influence on him. As a matter of fact, later on in this account, notice that Satan is allowed by God to take Job's children away. But who does he leave behind? He leaves Job's wife behind, and Job's wife's answer to Job is, why don't you just curse God and die? She becomes as much a temptation as others do, right? Well, Satan looked at Job's life. He looked at his family, his house, and the things within his house, and said, how can I use his relationships, the people that he has surrounded himself, against him? I think that's one of the reasons why we need to be careful who we marry. Do we not? Are they as dedicated to getting us to heaven as we are? Are they going to be a tool Satan can use against us? Or are they going to be someone that's going to be a rock to help us, a hedge to help us resist the bait in the water, if you will? And then third, notice that Satan had looked at all that Job had. He looked at all his possessions. What's really important to Job? If I take all of his flocks away, he'll just curse God and die, because God's provided those flocks. God's provided that wealth. And if I remove all of that, then Job will certainly curse God. We know that's not the case, but what are those things in our life that grow to become more important to us than God? You know, it's interesting in the Gospel of Mark in chapter 4, he tells us 3 parables about the seed. And the third one is the mustard seed. And he talks about how the mustard seed needs to grow to become the largest tree in our garden. The kingdom seed needs to become the most important thing in our life. And when we allow other seeds to grow up to be more important than God, more important than the kingdom seed in our life, we create an environment where Satan can tempt us. He can lure us, and based on those desires that we have, we can be taken away we can be dragged off and enticed by our own desires. So he looked at his character, he looked at his house, and he looked at all that he has. Brothers and sisters, I would argue that we need to look at those three areas of our life as well. First, we need to start with ourselves. We've got to look at who we are. What are those character flaws that we need to work on, right? What are those things in our life that we really need to do better with? Second, we need to look at our household and recognize the temptation that it can be. Notice how many times you try to teach somebody the gospel, but their family pulls them back into the world because their family aren't Christian. That can certainly be a temptation. And we also need to look at our material possessions and make sure that Satan doesn't have a way into our life through those things of the world. Now, James is going to talk about that quite a bit. As a matter of fact, in chapter 4, he's going to say, is it not your pleasures that are really driving you? Those things, that worldliness has become so important, is dragging you away. That you want friendship with the world more than you want a relationship with God. It's exactly what James is talking about here in 1:14, that idea that we are carried away and enticed by our own lusts. And he says, when he is carried away and enticed by his own lusts, when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. Now, I want you to notice the wording here again very carefully. James uses terminology just like a woman giving birth, conceiving and giving birth to a child. And he talks about lust and how that lust conceives, sows a seed inside us. That seed grows in us, which ultimately gives birth to the act of sin. And when sin is born, it brings forth our death, right? So what's he mean? Well, when lust is conceived, go back to our illustration of David for just a second. David is tempted on that rooftop. He sees beautiful Bathsheba. He is tempted. What does he do? Well, if he rejects that lustful desire and leaves and drives it from his mind, never goes back to it, then that lust can't conceive in his heart. He can't let it fester. He can't let it grow and mature into giving birth to the sin. He's killed it off, right? But what typically happens with the lust? He saw her and he allowed that to conceive in his heart. Now, again, maybe I'm adding a little bit to the text, but when you go back and read through that account, he saw her up on the roof. Again, if he leaves the roof and just disregards it, he's going to be okay. But what does he do? Obviously, he continues to think about her. He continues to allow that lust to conceive to the point where he ultimately calls for her. He wants to meet her face to face. Well, why? That's so dangerous. Why would you do that? Because he has allowed that lust to conceive in his heart. That conception is now growing in him to the point where he gives birth to the sin. He not only meets with her, maybe even his intention initially was, I don't intend to sleep with her. I just want to meet this woman. She's beautiful. I want to talk with her. Bad idea, right? And once he meets with her, he sleeps with her, they conceive a child, and you know the rest of the story as we talked about earlier. Well, that lust has done the same thing in David's heart. It's conceived, it grows to the point where it gives birth to the act of sin. If we can stop it before it conceives in our heart, then we haven't sinned. No sin has occurred yet. As a matter of fact, when we look at the Hebrew letter, Hebrew reminds us in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15, that Jesus was tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. What does that tell us? That tells us that the temptation itself is not the sin. James would agree in this regard that when lust is conceived, it brings forth when we allow the temptation to fester and work its way into our heart, and we allow it to grow, that's when it can give birth to the sin. And so we need to learn to guard our hearts, right? We need to be careful to cultivate the soil. How many parables did Jesus talk about where our heart is the soil, right? We've got to cultivate the soil of our hearts and make sure that nothing evil is being sown in that soil. We've got to pull those weeds as soon as we can. We can't let them grow into fruition, because when they grow, they become sin. And when they give birth to sin, notice what he says. When lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is accomplished, when sin reaches its design end, it brings forth our death. Now, he's talking here about spiritual death, not necessarily physical death, although it certainly could in some circumstances be our physical death. But I believe he's talking about our spiritual death, right? When we sin, we separate. Sin is that which separates us from God. And when we allow sin to reign in our life, when it goes unchecked, then we ultimately can become separated from God and die. Now, I want to stop there for just a second, because I think we have the wrong concept of sin. This isn't James for just a second, but I think it's important. Remember what 1 John 1, chapter 1, verse 7 says, that if we walk in the light as he is in the light, the blood of his son cleanses us from what? All sin. It's not that we sin and we die spiritually and we're lost, and then we repent and we're forgiven, and then we sin again and we die. According to 1 John, Jesus' blood continually cleanses us. And John's going to go on to talk about those who practice sin, right? That's the idea of when sin can separate us from God, is when we allow sin to reign in our lives, when it goes unchecked, when we're not trying to kill it off, when we're not trying to do anything about it. As a matter of fact, Paul even said in Romans chapter 8, "Oh, wretched man that I am, I do the things that I hate doing. I don't want to do these things. I know I shouldn't do these things, and yet I do them anyway." It sounds like Paul struggled just like we all do. So what do we do according to James? We have to guard our lusts. We have to worry and talk to ourselves, look at what we lust after. Now, what is lust? Lust is just an unhealthy desire for anything. Sometimes, again, in a modern context, we think of lusts as just a sexual desire, and it can certainly mean that. But lust, you can lust after all kinds of things. The word literally means a strong longing or desire. We can lust after power. We can lust after influence. We can lust after wealth. We can lust after all kinds of things other than just sexual desire. Certainly, sexual desire is part of this word, but we have to look at those things that we desire in the world, and we got to ask ourselves, why? Are they things God wants us to desire? Do we lack wisdom, seeing our earthly situation the way God would see it and act accordingly? What about the things God said that he does not want us to have? Do we still desire those things? Do we lust after those things? And in that lust, do we allow it to conceive to the point where it gives birth to sin? You see, that's not God's fault. That's our fault. And so we are involved in our own sin problem, aren't we? And at some level, we're the solution to our own sin problem. Now, we do that through the strength God supplies. We do that through a knowledge of Scripture. We can do that through wisdom. We can do that by keeping our lusts in check. But we can't blame God. We can't blame Satan. We have to look to ourselves when we have a sin problem and ask us why we have a sin problem. You know, I teach the Gospel of Mark, and some of you may have taken that course. I hope you found it helpful if you did. But in Mark chapter 8, Jesus gives a teaching that I have come to believe is this thread that really describes all of Christianity. And he says, whoever wants to come after me, whoever wants to follow after me, he's got to deny himself, take up his cross, and follow. That denial of self is really where the sin problem is either killed or it conceives. We see something and we're tempted. What do? Do we deny ourselves, or do we feed that desire that we now have? Really comes up to us, doesn't it? And I would argue that in most cases, the vast majority of cases, the reason we sin is because we want to. We want the thing that is causing our sin, whatever that sin may be. We want to tell that lie so that we don't get in trouble. We want that sexual desire. We want that thing that is trying to separate us from God. And we know we shouldn't have it in most cases. There are times when that may be a little bit tougher to discern. But in most cases, we know we shouldn't do it. And yet what happens? We decide to do it. What happened? Our sin, our temptation dragged us off. We allowed it to conceive. We grabbed the bait. It now conceives, and ultimately it gives birth to the sin. We've got to learn to be involved in that process and stop that process, don't we? Can't blame God. Can't blame Satan. Have to look to ourselves and what we desire. And so he says in verse 16, don't be deceived, my beloved brethren. Don't be deceived about the source of your temptation and sin. It isn't God. Don't use that excuse to pin it on somebody else, because when you do, then everything becomes someone else's fault, not yours. And it's not until we examine ourselves, it's not until we look at ourselves and really look at why we're committing that sin that we'll solve it. If we blame our sin on everyone else that's involved, we'll never get to the heart of the problem, because the heart is in our chest, not theirs. Now, they may be evil people that are causing some things in our life, but we're the ones that allow ourselves to remain in that situation. Just like Joseph and Potiphar's wife, right? Sometimes the way of escape is simply the door. But sometimes we don't want to walk out the door. We want to stay in that environment. We've got to ask ourselves why. And it's interesting, if you jump down just a little bit, this self-examination is going to be, he's going to use it as an illustration when he talks about a man in verse 23 who looks at his natural face in the mirror. He's going to continue this discussion about do not be deceived. And now he's going to talk about the word of truth in just a moment. We're going to get there in just a second. And ultimately, he's going to say the man who examines himself, looks at his natural face in the mirror of God's word. Now he can identify those issues and deal with them, right? But if we say that the problem belongs elsewhere, guess what? We're going to say they need to look in the mirror, not me. And we never are going to deal with the source of our problem. We cannot preach and we can't walk through life holding a mirror up to everyone else if we won't look in it ourselves, right? And so he says, don't be deceived. Don't be lied to by yourself or by others. God is not the source of your temptation. You are. And if you're going to deal with it and if you're going to solve it in your life, you have to start with yourself and your desires and lusts. And so he says, instead of God being the source, now in verse 17, he's going to give us another reason why God is not the source of our temptation. He started out with because God isn't tempted by evil and he doesn't tempt anyone. But now he's going to say in verse 17, every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, in whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. You see, we don't have to wonder whether God one day is tempting us and one day is rewarding us, because that would be evil, right? As we talked about, if God one day is saying, I love you and I want you to be saved, and the next day he is intentionally tempting us to fall, how do we know which day is which? I mean, how do we know what's going on? And notice the terminology that James uses here. He uses astronomy to make his point. And he says, every good thing given, good things come from God, not bad things, not evil. Temptation is a bad thing, and it does not come from God. Every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above. coming down from the Father of lights. What is this Father of lights terminology? It's actually unique to this verse in Scripture. Well, when we go back to the creation account, you'll remember that God made the lights. You remember in Genesis, during the creation, he made one light to govern the day and one to govern the night, right? The moon and the stars govern the night, the lights at night. The sun controls the day. So he's referring to those astronomical bodies, and he's talking about God being the Father of those lights. And he says, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. Those lights that God created in the beginning of the creation account, they rule the night and the day, but they also change throughout the day and the night, don't they? As a matter of fact, they shift their shadows on the ground. For the longest time, sundials were one of the ways to tell time. If you put a wedge or a stick in the ground, the shadow that it casts will tell you what time of day it is, depending on where you are in the world. The interesting thing is, if you continue to watch that shadow moves throughout the day. As a matter of fact, it's never stationary. It doesn't stay in one place. It's always moving because the sun is always moving. We are actually always moving, but the sun is moving in the sky. The moon is always moving in the sky. And as a result, the shadows are always shifting. So what is James's point? God is not like the lights that he created. There is no variation. There is no shifting shadow. You don't have to worry if one day he's trying to save you and the next day he's trying to cause you to fall. God doesn't work that way. He's not working both sides. Now, I find it interesting that he would use this idea of variation and shifting shadow to remind us of the consistency of God to always give good things. Now, here's where we can sometimes get into trouble. He says every good thing given. But who gets to determine whether the thing is good or not? Do we or does God? You see, if they come from God and they're good from God, God determines what's good. The reason I mention that is because some people will tell me here, well, what about some bad things that happen in our life that might be discipline from God? God might be punishing us. That's not a good thing. Is it? If God is disciplining us through circumstances in our life, is that a good thing from God's point of view? I would argue that it is a very good thing. As a matter of fact, Scripture talks throughout Scripture about us being God's children. And what do parents do with their children? They discipline their children. Why? Because they love them. So when you discipline your child, is that a good thing? It is from the parent's point of view. Is it a good thing from the child's point of view? Not necessarily. What do we need in our life in order to understand the good thing given? We need wisdom, right? We're back to that concept that James is going to filter throughout this text, this idea of seeing earthly things the way God would see them, the way God would see them, not the way we would see them, and function accordingly. Sometimes we see something bad and we think that's bad, but really, if it's discipline from God, it's a good thing because he's trying to correct us. He's trying to put us back on the right track. He's trying to provide for us what we need to get back in line. Maybe he's providing the means of escape. And so if it's a good thing, we can trust that it comes from God. If it's an evil thing, we can trust that it does not come from God. And that's James's point. Now, I want you to notice a phrase. How often do you notice I say that? Sorry. But we do need to really watch the terminology of Scripture, don't we? There's really cool things in your Bible study when you notice the specific wording of things and where it appears elsewhere. Notice here, he says that every good thing and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights. I want you to flip over to chapter 3 for just a minute. In chapter 3, in the introduction of the book, we talked about this wisdom, and we talked about where it comes from. And we mentioned that James actually is going to contrast two different wisdoms, that which does not come from above and that which does come from above. And if we look at James chapter 3, the context really starts in verse 13, but notice in verse 14, but if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This wisdom that causes bitter jealousy and selfish ambition is not that which, what? Comes down from above. What did he say here in chapter 1? Good things come down from above. So if this wisdom in chapter 3 that causes these teachers to have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition, he's going to later on describe them, that it's going to cause strife and turmoil in the church. If that does not come down from above, that tells us it's not a good thing. And we don't want it, right? It doesn't come from God. As a matter of fact, notice verse 15. He says, this wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, it's natural, it's demonic. The source of that wisdom is not God. It doesn't come down from God. It comes from Satan's thinking. And then he contrasts in verse 17 of chapter 3, but the wisdom from above, right? Now he's going to tell us what wisdom from God actually looks like. And all of that comes back to this verse in chapter 1, verse 17, when he makes the argument that our temptations don't come from God, only good things come from God. And they come down from the Father who made the great lights. And even though the great lights shift their shadows on the ground, God's not like those shadows. He doesn't change throughout the day. He doesn't shift. He's consistent. He always gives good gifts, and you can count on him to always provide good things and perfect gifts. And notice he's going to now say, in the exercise of his will, he brought us forth by the word of truth. Verse 18, he's going to give us an illustration of one of those good things that has been given. The word of truth has been given by God. It's a good thing that comes down from above. He uses it to bring us forth. Do you see that? Now, if you write in your Bibles, and I hope that you do, I'd like you to circle that phrase, he brought us forth by the word of truth. Notice that it's the same as the phrase back in verse 17 or verse 15. Notice when lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. You see, sin brings forth death, but God is working to bring us forth through the word of truth. He's not the source of the temptation that would cause you to sin and die. He's the source of the solution, the word of truth that you can use to resist those lusts and temptations. That's the good thing that comes down from above. And it is this word of truth. So that he says in the exercise of God's will, it's his desire, it's his intention, not to tempt you, but to bring you forth by the word of truth, so that. Now, I want you to notice that word so that, wherever you see it in scripture. So that always tells us the why. I love those two little words because in every verse that they appear, they tell you the why something is happening. Why is God trying to bring us forth by his word of truth? So that we would be a kind of first fruits among his creatures. What does that mean? Well, let's again be reminded that James is writing to a very Jewish audience, right? These are Christians who were from Judaism. We really don't have any Gentiles in the church yet, if our dating of James is correct. And so to a Jewish mind, what is the concept of first fruits? Well, when we go back into the Old Testament, we see this idea of the first fruits. And the first fruits were that which was offered to God. He wanted the sacrifice of the first fruits to always be given to him, the first of the cattle, the first of our crop, the best. As a matter of fact, when Israel is allowed to take the promised land, if you remember when they go to Jericho, he does not allow them to take any of the spoils from Jericho. Why? Because Jericho was the first fruit of the promised land that he had given to Israel. And he wanted that to be given to him. He wanted that to be dedicated to him. And so he demanded that they observe the ban and nothing in the city of Jericho could be taken for themselves. We know the story. One individual denies that ban and it ultimately cost him his life. But the point is that Jericho was a first fruit. Well, notice what James is saying, that we become a kind of first fruits. As Christians, those that are brought forth by the word of truth, when we observe the gospel in the text, the word of truth, and then we obey that gospel, we become the pinnacle of God's creatures. We become a kind of first fruit, a spiritual offering, if you will, a spiritual harvest for God, because his word did what it was designed to do. It brings forth this spiritual harvest, and we are offered to God as a first fruit. We become the most precious part of his creation to him. And that's a powerful thought, isn't it? That we, through this word of truth that he's provided us, can become so important to God, that we become a kind of spiritual harvest. And when we think of all of the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels about the harvest is plentiful, but the work is few. God wants to reap the harvest of those that will respond to his word of truth, obey it, and become this kind of first fruits. He wants us to become more important than all the rest of his creation. And so he has provided the word of truth for us to do that. Notice he continues on and says, "This you know, my beloved brethren." Well, what do you know? Now the question becomes that this you know could either point back to verse 17 and 18. He's either saying, you know that good things come from God. You know that only good things come from God, that he doesn't play with our emotions. He doesn't play with our salvation. We're not his puppets. You know these things. You know that he's working through the word of truth to bring you forth as a kind of first fruits. Or he could be referring to what he's about to say in verse 19. Now, verse 19 is a verse that I hear preached quite often, and I'm going to suggest that sometimes we take it out of its context and we teach it in a way that doesn't honor what James is talking about. Oftentimes, we're probably most familiar with this verse out of James. And notice verse 19 says, "This you know, my beloved brethren, but everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger." And maybe you've been in a Bible class, or maybe you've heard a sermon where this verse has been used, and the preacher or the Bible class teacher will then say, so what's he talking about? We must be quick to hear our brother when they want to talk, right? How often are we just listening in order to interrupt? Certainly that's my problem sometimes. And so we need to be quick to hear others when they speak. We need to be slow to speak. We need to be slow to answer what they say. We need to not be in such a rush to interject our opinions into the conversation. And we need to be slow to become angry at our brother. Why? Because the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. And I would argue that all of those things are biblical concepts, and all of those things are things Christians ought to do. Trust me, I am not suggesting that anything in that Bible class or that sermon is untrue or false biblically. But I do not think that's what James is talking about here. When we talk about context, when we talk about the passages that surround a verse, they help us determine what the verse is about. And I want you to notice this thread. Again, if you mark in your Bibles, and I hope you do, I'd like you to mark these for just a minute. Notice in verse 18, he mentions the word of truth, right? That's the illustration that he's in the middle of. God gives good things, not evil things. He doesn't give temptation. He only gives good things. One of the good things he's given is the word of truth. And he's in the middle of that illustration about the word of truth when he talks about this quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. I want you to also notice verse 21. I know we're not there yet. But therefore, putting aside all filthiness and all that remains of wickedness, in humility receive what? The word, just like the word of truth that he mentioned in verse 18. In humility receive the word with it implanted, which is able to save your souls. Notice verse 22. But prove yourself doers of what? Doers of the word, and not merely hearers who delude themselves. Verse 23, for if anyone is a hearer of what? The word, and not a doer, he is like a man that looks at his natural face in the mirror. For once he has looked at himself and gone away, has immediately forgotten what kind of person he was. But one who looks intently at what? The perfect law, that would be the word of truth. You remember he said good things and perfect gifts come from God. And then he said, this word of truth is one of those good things. It's one of those perfect gifts. He describes it as the perfect law. One who looks at this perfect law, the law of liberty, and lives by it, abides by it, not having become a forgetful hearer, but a doer of work. This man will be blessed in what he does. He'll be God approved in what he does. Notice if he's mentioning the word of truth in verse 18, and he's talking about the word of truth in verse 21, and he's talking about the word of truth in verse 22, and he's talking about the word of truth in 23, and he's talking about the word of truth in verse 25. What do you think he's talking about in the middle of that in 19 and 20? He's talking about the word of truth. You see, this isn't about our relationship with others horizontally. This is about our response to the good and perfect gift that has come down from above, that God is using to bring us forth as a kind of first fruits. And if it's going to bring us forth as a kind of first fruits, guess what we know? If it's going to have that power in our life, we got to be quick to hear it. Why do we need to be quick to hear it? Because it's what God is using to bring us forth as a kind of first fruits among his creatures. Notice he's going to say in verse 21 that if we receive the word in humility and implant it in our life, it has the power to save our souls. So the word has the power to bring us forth as a kind of first fruits. It has the power to save our souls. But what's our responsibility in that? We have to be quick to hear it. Why should we want to be quick to hear it? Because it's what God is using to save our souls. It's what God is using to bring us forth as a kind of first fruits. It's what God is using as a defense against the lusts and temptations that we have a tendency to chase after. Do you see the context? Do you see this flow of thought? We've got to be quick to hear what God has to say, because that's how our souls get saved. And if we aren't willing to listen to God's word of truth, if we don't want to hear it, we're not going to do it, are we? And so he says, you need to be quick to hear. You need to be slow to speak. Well, what does that mean? Aren't we supposed to evangelize? Aren't we supposed to go out? I would agree that we are. But we also need to be careful about how we present God's word of truth, don't we? Some are saying that God is the source of the temptation. Notice, remember in verse 13, let no one say when he's being tempted by God. Some are saying, if you're being tempted, it's because God is tempting you. That's an adulteration of God's word. They aren't teaching the word of truth accurately there, are they? I always think of Job's friends. And at the end of the book of Job, God condemns the friends because he said, you didn't represent me accurately. You said things that weren't true about who I am and the way I work. Well, the reality is if we're going to teach God's word, if we're going to share it with others, we got to be accurate. We got to be careful. We got to be slow to speak it. As a matter of fact, flip over to chapter 3 for just a minute. And in chapter 3, verse 1, he's going to warn them, let not many of you become teachers, my brethren, knowing that as such you will receive a stricter judgment, or actually, more accurately to the original language, a greater condemnation. You see, Teachers are going to receive a stricter judgment because they're representing God to the people. And God's word of truth, when it's taught correctly and it's sown into a heart that wants to obey, it can bring that person forth as a kind of first fruits, a spiritual harvest. When they implant it in their life, it can save their soul. But if we distort it, if we change it, if we teach it incorrectly, it no longer has the power to bring them forth as a kind of first fruits, and it no longer has the power to save their souls. And so we've got to be quick to hear it. We've got to be slow to speak it, but we also, thirdly, need to be slow to become angry at what? The word of truth. Have you ever taught somebody the gospel and everything's going really well until you get to baptism? And then when you show them the verses in scripture that suggest and teach them that they must be baptized, they immediately get angry and the whole countenance of the discussion changes. I've had that happen to me a number of times in my life. I'm sure many of you have as well. What happened? They became angry at the word of truth, didn't they? They probably became angry at you, but really they became angry at what scripture says, because they were like, I don't have to do that. I don't have to be baptized for the forgiveness of sins. That's a work, and we're not saved by work. And they give all of their justifications, but they blow their top. They get angry at the word of truth. Why do we not get angry at the word of truth? Because God's using it to bring us forth as a kind of first fruits. If we get angry at it, we're not going to do it. And as a matter of fact, that's exactly what he says in verse 20. For the anger of man does not work the righteousness of God. You see, the word of truth contains the righteousness of God, the right things of God, the things that he wants us to do so that we can become a kind of first fruits, so that we can have our souls saved. And if we become angry at that word of truth, we don't work the righteousness of God. And if we don't work the righteousness of God, if we don't respond to that word of truth, it won't bring us forth. It's not because the word doesn't have the power. It's because we reject the power of the word to bring us forth, right? We put ourselves back in charge. Our lusts and our desires drag us away from the word of truth. We don't respond to them. Do you see what James is doing here? He argued that God isn't the source of our temptation. We're the problem. And then he said, God is actually working through the word of truth to bring you forth to solve this temptation problem so that you can have your soul saved. But you've got to work to be quick to hear it, slow to speak it, and slow to become angry at it. You've got to want to work the righteousness of God in your life. Now, it's not about earning your salvation. No one is suggesting that we do these things to earn our way to heaven, but we do them in response to the lordship of God. We're going to get there in chapter 2. He's going to explain this relationship of faith and works. So we'll save that for later on in chapter 2. But for right now, just understand that we're not talking about earning anything. We don't do enough righteousness that God has to let us in, but we work the righteousness found in the word of truth because we understand that God is using that word of truth to save our souls. Do you see it? And so he says, therefore, because the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God, because God is working in these good and perfect gifts to bring us forth, he says, therefore, putting aside all filthiness and all that remains of wickedness, in humility, humbleness, welcome the word implanted, which is able to save your souls. You see, this whole context is about the word of truth and it being a good and perfect gift that God's using to bring us forth. And he says here in verse 21 that we've got to put aside filthiness and all that remains of wickedness. We need to continually be working to do that in our life. We need to be continually striving to get rid of those things, those temptations, those lusts and desires. We've got to be looking to God's word to do that and get rid of this word filthiness is really moral uncleanness. and all that remains of wickedness and evil, depravity. We got to set that aside. We got to take it off. Now, he says putting aside, but this is literally to cast it off. This is like taking off clothes. You literally take those things off that described you before and you throw them aside. And in that moment, when we work to get rid of that, we in humility and humbleness, we receive or welcome God's word implanted into our life. Now, notice that this word that can save us must become implanted is the word that he uses. Some translations use the word engrafted. And if you have been on a farm, or I grew up in Arizona where there were a lot of citrus trees, and they would actually graft branches into trees. And when you graft a branch into a tree, what you do is you cut a wedge at one of the Y's of the tree branches. You cut a wedge in there, and then you cut a branch from another tree, and you match that wedge, and you shove them together, and you bind them all together. And eventually what will happen is that that new branch will become part of that tree. It'll literally join itself to the tree to the point where you can't get that branch out anymore. It will actually grow together to become part of the original tree. That's how he describes the word in our life, is that we receive it in humility. We set ourselves aside. We humble ourselves before the source of wisdom, God. We understand that these good things come down from him. We seek that good thing and we implant it in our life. It becomes part of us. We live it out day by day. As a matter of fact, in verse 25, he's going to talk about the man who abides by, lives by that perfect law, the word of truth. And so it becomes part of our life to the point where if you try to remove it, you're going to have to break the branch or kill the tree. Is the word implanted in our lives? Is it become so much a part of us that it now describes who we are, that we're working to cast off the wickedness and the evil, and we're allowing his good and perfect gift of the word of truth to become part of us, to engraft itself into our life to the point where it grows in us and describes who we are? That's really the goal here, is that we would allow the word to become engrafted, implanted into our life so that it becomes a permanent part of who we are. And when we do that, notice it is able to save your soul. Now, that word for able is a word that you've probably heard before. It's a Greek word, dunamai. And some preachers like to suggest that it's the word that we get our word dynamite from. That drives me a little crazy, to be honest with you. It's not that we're blowing anything up. It's the power word. It has the power to save our souls when we receive it in humility. We don't get angry at it. We don't in our pride reject it. We in humility receive it, implant it in our lives, let it become part of us. Then it has the power. It is able to save our souls. But what if we don't engraft it? Does it have the power to save our souls? I would argue that it doesn't, because we aren't doing it, which is exactly where James is going to go with this. Now, again, I'm not suggesting that we have the power to save our souls or not, but we have the power to accept the truth that God is offering us and allow that to save our soul or not, aren't we? Whether we're going to do it or not. And so notice he says that it has the power to save your souls and implant it, but you've got to prove yourselves doers of that word, not merely hearers who have deluded yourself. James gets right to the heart of the problem. We've got to become doers of God's word of truth. Now, the word do here is a Greek word that really has its origins in the Greek gods. The Greek gods were able to make things happen, people believed. And it's that idea of to make happen. We've got to make God's word happen in our life. We've got to be willing to do what he said. Why? Because we recognize that it's a good and perfect gift that's come down from above. We recognize that wisdom comes down from God. It's contained in his word of truth. And when we study that word of truth and we apply it in our lives, we do those things, guess what? We can take off the wickedness and filthiness and cast it aside. We can put on salvation. We can implant God's truth in our life, and it can mold us and shape us. It can help us resist the temptations that we were originally blaming on God. Now we recognize it's not God's fault, it's my fault. How do I deal with that? I implant God's word in my life, knowing that it's able to save my soul, and I become a doer of that word, not just a hearer of that word who has deluded themselves into believing that God is working in their lives. Brothers and sisters, there's a scary statement there, that we can delude ourselves into believing that we're okay with God because we just heard what he had to say. You know, throughout the Gospels, especially in the Gospel of Mark, multiple times Jesus teaches, when he teaches the parables, he who has ears, let him hear. The word hear is not just listen with your ears, but listen in order to obey. It's actually translated obey in a number of verses in the New Testament. We've got to not just think that if we show up at the church building and we hear God's word, that we're saved, that word has become implanted in our life, that we have become a kind of first fruits, that we have had our souls saved. Because I'm going to tell you right now, if you're not doing the word in your life, and it's not just doing it in the church building, I'm talking about doing the word in your life, doing the things God wants you to do, manifesting those characteristics that he wants you to manifest in the world. If you're not doing Christianity, you're not saved, because God's not leading you. You're leading yourself. You're doing the things you want to do. And we can lie to ourselves. We can deceive ourselves into believing we're okay with God just by hearing his word. You know, good job, preacher. That was a great sermon. And 20 minutes later, we couldn't tell you what the sermon was about, let alone we have no intention whatsoever of actually living it out during the next week. Preachers that are out there, I would argue that part of our job is to teach them the doing of our sermons, right? If you're a preacher out there, I strongly suggest that you look at what is the doing that you want them to do in your sermon, because otherwise we can be training them to be forgetful hearers, can't we? As teachers in Bible classes, do we get to the application? You know, so many times I've been in Bible classes where the teacher at the end of the class would say, well, I had a lot of application to discuss, but we just ran out of time. Well, I get that happens, but what's the point? The point of our lesson should be the doing of the word that we just studied. Here's this Bible teaching. How do you implant it in your life? How do you do it day by day? How do you put it into practice? And that's really what we should be focused on, because otherwise we just become this forgetful hearer who has deluded themselves. And he's going to talk about that when he says, for if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man that looks at his natural face in the mirror. I've illustrated this a number of times in a Bible class where I've messed up my collar, or I've been wearing my tie and it's all out of whack, and I'll mess up my hair and I'll put some mud on my face. And people will say, oh, you got something on your cheek there. And it's like, no, I don't. I just looked in the mirror. I don't see anything. Do we go to the word of truth? And the word of truth here is the mirror. Why do you look in a mirror? Everybody that's listening to this, why did you look at a mirror some point in your day to day? It was to see what you looked like and fix the things that you needed to fix, wasn't it? I mean, if you have some spinach or something in your teeth and you go to the mirror and you're like, oh, wow, I got some, and you walk away and you don't fix it, there was no point in looking in the mirror, was there? You look in the mirror to see what's wrong and to fix it, to be doers of those things that God wants you to fix. And so he says, but if anyone is a hearer and not a doer, he's like a man that looks at his natural face. Nothing is hidden before God's word of truth. When we look at God's word of truth with an honest heart, we see exactly who we are. Nothing hidden. We can lie to everybody else. We can lie to everybody in the church building. We can lie even to our families. We can lie to everybody else. But when we look at God's word of truth with an honest heart, we see our natural face in the mirror. We see our weaknesses. We see our failings. We see our strengths, but we also see those things that need to be addressed and fixed. And so he says that this man who looks at his natural face, for once he has looked at himself and has gone away, he immediately forgot what kind of man he was, what kind of person he was. It didn't do him any good to look in the mirror in the first place. If you're not going to fix what you see in the mirror, then why did you look in the mirror? I would argue with you, if you don't intend to do the things that you read in Scripture, why do you bother to read it? Except to delude yourself. Well, I read Scripture, therefore I'm a child of God. No, you do Scripture, therefore you're a child of God. You live the way God wants you. You become a doer of the word. It's when you implant the word in your life and it becomes part of who you are and what you do, it has the power to save your souls. And so he says that this man forgets what he looked like. He looked in the mirror, but he walked away, forgot what he looked like. You know, if you've got some mud on your face and you notice in the mirror, but you don't fix it and you walk away, guess what? You don't see it anymore. And after a moment or two, you forget that it's there. And you just walk through life continuing to do the things that you always did, and you're not changing. You're not implanting the word. You're not fixing those things. But he says, notice the contrast in verse 25. But one who looks intently in that mirror, the perfect law. That's where you get in real close, isn't it? I mean, that's where you're looking at all the details. You're not just standing back trying to take in the big picture. You're looking intently in that mirror at the little things in your life, the things that you need to work on. But one who looks intently at the perfect law, the law of liberty, and abides by it. That man, not having become a forgetful hearer, but a doer of work. The New American Standard says an effectual doer. That's a poor translation. New King James says a doer of work. That's a better translation. Having become a forgetful hearer, but a doer of work, this man will be God approved in what he does. Remember, that word blessed means God approved. We're God approved when we do, not when we just hear. It's one thing to hear it. It's another thing to actually put it into practice. We have to learn to abide by it. Now, that's not a word we use very often anymore either. Abide. One of the ways that I describe that to people is you abide in an abode. What's an abode? An abode is a place that you live, right? A house is your abode. But we don't use that. It's kind of old language. But we abide, we live in an abode. Well, the same thing is true here. Notice what he's saying. The one who looks intently in that mirror, that's a perfect gift from God, sees his natural face, and then abides by what he sees in that word of truth. He lives by what he sees. He does it day by day. He works on it in the world. Now, again, it doesn't mean he's perfect, but he works at it. He puts it into practice. He becomes a doer. That man will be God approved in what he does. And notice he's going to give an illustration in verse 26 of a man who's a hearer and not a doer. If anyone thinks himself to be religious and yet does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, he lies to himself, believing he's religious, even though he doesn't do what his religion tells him to do and guard his tongue, this man's religion is worthless. It has no value to him. It doesn't have the power to save his soul because he's not willing to do it. He looks at his natural face. He knows that Scripture says you should control your tongue. There are plenty of verses that tell us that we should control our tongue. I think of Psalm 39, verse 1. I will guard my ways that I may not sin with my tongue. I will guard my mouth as with a muzzle while the wicked are in my presence. Job 2, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not except his adversity. And in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. There's tons of passages in scripture that tell us we need to guard what comes out of our mouth. This man knows that, but he doesn't do it. James says this man's religion is vain. It's empty. It's fruitless. It's profitless. That's what the word means. It's vain. It has no value to him. Why? Because he's not willing to do it. He's heard it, but hearing it isn't enough. Brothers and sisters, you can sit in a pew the rest of your life. You can attend every Bible class between now and the time the Lord returns. Doesn't mean that you've implanted his word in your life. It doesn't mean that you've allowed it to save your soul. You see, we can be hearers who've deluded ourselves into believing that we are God's people, but we leave the church building. We tell the preacher, good job, or we tell the Bible class teacher, great job, but then we never put into practice what we've read. We never abide in his word. We never live it out. We never reach the doing. Now, again, I'm not suggesting that we can do enough righteousness to get ourselves to heaven. James is not talking at all about earning salvation. Again, we're going to talk about that in chapter 2. But it's not about earning anything. But if the king says do it and we don't do it, who's really king? Certainly not us, or certainly not him, because we're not doing what he wants us to do. We reject his authority, right? So we've got to recognize that that's where the humility comes in, isn't it? We've got to humble ourselves. We've got to lower ourselves and welcome the word into our life. Not just through our ears, but through our hands and through our feet and through our heart, doing the things that God wants us to do, putting his word into practice. Now, before we close, and I know we only have a couple of minutes, I do not want you to leave with the idea that until you do this perfectly, you're not saved. Again, John said in 1 John chapter 1, verse 7, that if we walk in the light, as he is in the light, the blood of his son cleanses us from what? All sin. All sin committed while walking in the light. We're not going to do it perfectly. God knows that. That's why he provides mercy. That's why he provides grace, is he knows that we're not going to do it perfectly. But if we just hear it and then we never try to do it, we aren't striving to apply it in our lives, we're not trying to do it, then there is no grace and there is no mercy, because we've simply rejected his authority as king of our lives. We've rejected his word of truth that he's using to try to bring us forth as a kind of first fruits, a spiritual harvest. We've rejected the word that he's using to save our souls. But it only has the power to save our souls when we implant it in our lives, when we become doers of it, when we put it into practice and abide by it. We live by it. Brothers and sisters, we all got to work and not just being hearers. We got to work the doing. And the world needs us to be doers, don't they? There are plenty of people out there that are hurting. We can be the source for them of truth. We can take the truth to them. We can help them during very difficult times. We can help them deal with trials and build their endurance. We can help them with their temptations that are causing them to fall away. We can help them by teaching them the word of truth. Be quick to hear, be slow to speak, be slow to become angry at the word of truth. But we ourselves have to be doers first. We have to live it out day by day, doing our best, knowing that God loves us and provides mercy and grace when we fail. But we are doers of the word and not merely hearers who delude ourselves. We'll stop there today. We're going to get into the end of chapter 1, verse 27. He's going to contrast this man who doesn't do his religion with what pure and undefiled religion is. But I want to talk about verse 27 and how it filters, how we look at the whole rest of the book. So since we're out of time, we're not going to get into 27 today, but I hope you've enjoyed the study today. I hope you have found it profitable. Again, we do this every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 12 to 1:30 Mountain Time, which is 2 to 3:30 Eastern Time. You can also find these videos stored on the Digital Bible Studies Facebook page. Ultimately, they'll be on the Bear Valley Bible Institute's YouTube channel as well. But I hope that you have found this profitable. I hope that you find your study of James challenging, as I do every time I teach it. But I hope that it's encouraged you this week to strive to be a doer of the word. God loves you. God wants to bring you forth as a kind of first fruits. He wants to save your soul. We just have to be those that respond in kind to that great, good, and perfect gift of his word of truth. I'm thankful that you want to study it. I am blessed to be able to share it with you. So until Monday, may God bless you and continue to watch over you. Thanks for your time.